get started?
Go ahead. I've started recording, so you're good to go.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Roundtable 2, Rewriting Canadian Comics History as part of the 80 Years and Beyond Symposium. My name is Benjamin Wu. I'm an Associate Professor of Communication and Media Studies at Carleton University, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion, ably assisted by Zach, who is on hand to monitor the chat and help us organize and field questions in the Q&A. For those of you who are maybe just joining us, as a reminder, this is a discussion-oriented session based on pre-recorded presentations by our 4 participants. If you haven't had a chance to view those participants, I'll ask one of the organizers to pop the link for that into the chat. Those videos will be available for you to catch up on or rewatch for the next 30 days. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our speakers, and I'll invite each of them to just make some very brief remarks to jog your memories of the presentations we're here to discuss and prime us for the conversation to follow. As moderator, I've prepared some questions to get us started, but we'll also make sure to allow lots of time for you, the audience, to get involved. Please feel free to use the chat feature in Zoom here to ask your questions at any time they occur to you during the panel. We especially invite questions from students. When a submitted question comes up, you'll have an opportunity to unmute yourself and ask it, or we can read it on your behalf. You can also use the raise hand function under reactions to ask a question when the Q&A period opens, and I will call on you at that time. As you heard, today's session is being recorded and will be publicly available for viewing post-conference. If you don't wish to appear in that recording, you can keep your camera off and your microphone muted. As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A but don't want to appear in the recording, the chat is here and we can read it for you. The chat is also being recorded along with the presentation, but any links posted there will be gathered and posted separately to registrants after the conference. As you can perhaps also see through a little call out banner at the top, we've enabled the live transcript for today's meeting. If you wish to view or alternately to hide these automatically generated closed captions, you can click on the live transcript button and then hit either hide subtitle or show subtitle. Okay, with that taken care of, let's go ahead and meet our presenters, and I'm going to introduce them in the order they were featured in the YouTube playlist for today's panel. So first up, we have Brian Montgomery, who has been a collector of Canadian created and published comics since the early 2000s. Brian has more recently begun researching and collecting queer or LGBTQIA+ Canadian comics to start a whole new collection, and has written articles on queer Canadian comics for Sequential magazine. He's seen and been across Canada, except for Labrador and Nunavut. He's played in gay rugby and hockey clubs and enjoys browsing used bookstores and local comic stores to discover some hidden gems. Brian, could you start us off with just a very brief synopsis of your presentation to help people remember and get oriented to the discussion today?
Yep, certainly, Benjamin. So my presentation was quickly at 10 minutes. I talk really fast, my apologies. But basically what I was looking at was the history of queer comics, starting from really from 71 until about the 2000s, and just discussing certain aspects of them as to how they went from more of a marginalized scene, which they really were at the time, and how it got pushed into the mainstream a lot by some of our allies more than the LGBTQ scene itself, and then talked about certain pressures around the LGBTQ scene. What you could talk about, what you couldn't talk about, what could be published. Obviously, the Comics Code Authority was at play. What Canadian society was willing to accept at the time. And then really, I mean, in this discussion, I'm prepared to talk about more than just what I did in the presentation, because definitely there has been a huge explosion since 2000, 2009 for queer comics out there in the Canadian scene.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Our next presenter is Darren Werschler, who is a professor at Concordia University, where he teaches 2 courses on the graphic novel and comic studies. With Laurie Emerson and UC Parika, he is the author of The Lab Book, Situated Practices in Media Studies, out from University of Minnesota Press this year. Darren, a couple of sentences to refresh our friend's memory on your presentation.
Thanks, Ben. So what I was doing is a kind of study of how value is created in comics criticism, centering on Martin Vaughan James's book, The Cage, in these two editions. And the questions that emerge out of this for me are, what are the practices and techniques that we use to create value in Canadian comics studies? What do these practices include and assume, and what do they exclude? And what kinds of objects do they privilege? And all of this is in the interest of getting to a point where we can ask if there's a better way to organize conversations around comic canons, all of that stuff that literary criticism, put to the test, 25 years ago. So what interests me is the idea of a kind of minor literature. This is from Deleuze and Guattari's work, but basically I'm thinking about this in terms of the everyday production, circulation, and consumption of creative work without making overblown claims about its value. And when thinking about comics at the Coach House in particular, what's striking to me is the way that comics criticism has overlooked the kind of ongoing mundane involvement of writers and artists in comics worlds in order to kind of focus on Vaughan James. And moreover, it's also overlooked the kind of obvious comics formats. And I didn't have any images in my talk. So just a kind of quick show and tell of some of those kinds of formats. This is Snore Comics #3, which is a kind of classic underground comic done in the late 60s, involving all of the members of General Idea. So it's also a very important early queer comic in Canadian comics history. Patricia Seaman's New Motor Queen City. This is a book that I did when I was at Coach House, and it's all kind of neo-situationist historieta based on Mexican comics. Another one, Greg Curneau and David McFadden's The Great Canadian Sonnet, published as a little big book with illustrations on every other page. And then finally, just of stuff that I had kicking around the house, this is John Riddell's book, Shit, with a cover from Chester Brown's Yummy Fur from The Man Who Couldn't Stop on the cover of it. So, I mean, this one in particular is interesting to me because it points to the fact that there are these ongoing points of overlap between comics worlds and the literary small press and conceptual art in Toronto that are happening all the time, that we ignore these things at our peril. But there's so much to talk about around this. The everyday practices of collecting and consuming and reading comics of Coach House authors. Some of this stuff is visible in the archives. Like, if you want to look at it, BP Nicholl's archives at Simon Fraser has his entire collection of Dick Tracy strips in it. I'm currently trying to find out what happened to his collection of original flats, but I know because I saw it that he had George Harriman flats and a variety of other things. So there was a very active comics readership at the Coach House, as well as this kind of process of everyday practice. So the question is, again, like, how do we talk about this without turning it into these are masterworks or canonical works that we need to talk about? We need a totally different framework in order to make sense of it.
Thanks, Darren. Next, we have Lorraine York, who is Distinguished University Professor of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University. Lorraine specializes in Canadian literature and celebrity culture. With 2007's Literary Celebrity in Canada, she contributed the first study of celebrities' impact on Canadian literary culture. She followed up with Margaret Atwood and the Labor of Literary Celebrity in 2013. Her 2018 book, Reluctant Celebrity, Affect and Privilege in Contemporary Stardom, theorizes reluctance as a product of privilege, and she is currently writing a book about reluctance's abjected other, that is eagerness, called Unseemly, Affect, Gender, New Media, and the Denunciation of Fame Hunger. Lorraine, a few words on your presentation.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you to the organizers for this invitation. It's a real pleasure. So just a very brief refresher about my presentation. I was using the work of Haida comics creator Michael Nicoll Yahgulanaas as a means of focalizing some questions basically about cultural contact in the world of comics and beyond the world of comics. And I found a very strong resonance with the notion developed by the Cree ethicist Willie Ermine called the ethical space of engagement. And it involves basically a type of epistemological relaxation where you are able to let loose somewhat your grip on the epistemologies and the framing perceptions that you have, and that you're able to somehow, for the moment, step into this other space, which for both Ermine and Yahgulanaas is risky, it's dangerous, it's difficult. And I was wondering whether these kinds of ideas might also work as a way of asking ourselves the question about operating in a discipline that is, organizing itself, at least certainly explicitly in this venue, as operating under the sign of the nation state. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Last but by no means least, special guest star Jamie Michaels, live from Canada's TV room, is a writer from Winnipeg. His most recent graphic novel, Christie Pitts, unpacks the tensions between immigrants and proto-fascists in 1930s Toronto that culminated in the Christie Pitts riot. The project is currently being adapted as both a documentary as well as an animated film in partnership with Crave TV and SGS Studios. Jamie is a Shirk Bombardier Doctoral Fellow and Killam Laureate at the University of Calgary, where he researches the potential of historically informed comics to enact social change. And he is the creative director of the boutique press Dirty Water Comics, which is currently accepting submissions. Jamie, a quick refresher on your presentation, please.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thank you to all the organizers and particularly Canada for hosting me on such very short notice here. The Cole's notes on my presentation is that I'm interested in the tensions between multiculturalism as an idea and multiculturalism as a practice, and that tension between propagating this idea of championing a multicultural ethos in Canada while often ignoring the historical realities that Canada is built upon. I'm looking at a loose association of new comics historians that are writing back against the colonial record, that are sharing lesser known or perhaps underrepresented histories. But in doing so, they're questioning a multiculturalism that can only exist within the framework of the European nation state. So can we consider this multicultural? Is it egalitarian window dressing on a colonial project? What does it mean to make Canadian comics? And what does it mean to write Canadian historical comics?
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you all. I'm really looking forward to talking with you about the cartoonists and texts that you've highlighted and how they might shift our perceptions of the history of comics production. The intention of this symposium is to mark and celebrate the 80th anniversary of the first Canadian comic book, but the beyond in its title also signals the need to question how each of those terms, first, Canadian, and comic book, works and how the kind of ideological work that they've done for us heretofore as we examine the past and chart the future of cartooning in this land. So let's begin the discussion, I think, by maybe taking some of Lorraine's provocations head on and hopefully using them to make some connections to the other presentations as well. The territory that is currently Canada is obviously, indeed, and has historically been a space of encounter between peoples and artistic traditions. So to begin, to what extent or in what ways does some idea of Canada function or not as a point of reference for the histories that you're relating to us in your 4 different presentations? And what other communities, traditions, scenes, or networks are important for constituting the artworks that you've brought forward for us to discuss today? That's for any of the 4 presenters to start us off.
maybe could I start actually just by gesturing to Brian's paper, because I thought that that his presentation really indicated some important ways that we need to acknowledge the historic operations of the state in the production and reception, often the difficulties of reception of comics. So I thought I just open by pointing to his presentation.
Did you get to pick up that baton, Brian?
I am actually, thanks, Lorraine. No, I mean that really is what queer comics. I mean, even in the spectrum of queer, back in the 70s and stuff, that it really was homosexuality. That was it, right? And we did talk about lesbianism, bisexuality, and other forms of our community that have increased in knowledge and awareness wasn't really talked about. Canada, 69, the decriminalization of the code, couple of months literally before Stonewall. But in the larger North American context, Canadian comics and creators are in a North American market. And you have those issues largely where you have trying to even get content that comes from Europe down to the States and then trying to get across the borders to Canadian, to both bookstores like Glad Day and Little Sisters, that honestly, when they first started off in the 80s, they were being raided because they had quote unquote obscene material. And that is why you had a lot of creators going through groups like the Body Politic being formed in 71, then forming more formalized as Pink Triangle Press. And it really threw a lot of their newspapers like Extra and some of the magazines that were happening across the communities that really catered to, at the time, the gay scene or the lesbian scene. Like, it was very insular on that. And I think some of the challenges we had was, even though the comic code didn't apply to underground, didn't apply to newspaper magazines, except for large mainstream presses like United Press. And that's why you see people like, some of our allies like Rand Holmes, like Lorraine, for better or for worse, pushing those envelopes, because some of our allies realize, you know what, I have to be the voice on that one, because I know queer people and I know that I understand where they're coming from, but I can't represent them in their own voices, but I can certainly represent and push that envelope to Main Street Press to go, why don't you have this? And one of my folks, Sean Martin, wonderful, sadly passed away, never had the chance to meet him, but he actually says in an interview to CBC that I watched, that he basically said he actually sent Doc and Raider to the Globe Mail to say, hey, I'm being published internationally in 12 countries in 12 different languages and stuff like that. Can you publish this? And he waited and waited, and then he pushed again and said, hi, so I'm wondering, can I get syndicated into your newspaper once in a while, so that. And literally he says the response was the Globe Mail wasn't ready. Right, a lot of this was the time no one was ready, and I think with the Comics Code and underground and independent presses helping to get more of these anthologies published out, suddenly we're getting into more acceptance of this to say, yeah. And in terms of that, the Canada context for these things is, they get context in North America, but a lot of stories like Doc and Radar, you can tell there's something Toronto about it, there's something Winnipeg about it, even Noreen Stevens' work in Winnipeg. Leanne Francis' work coming from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, you can see some stuff if you know that kind of area well. But for a lot of Canadians, we're very used to every queer story must either take place in Vancouver or Toronto. And that's usually what we see. And that's why in part of my research, it was very refreshing to see that no, it actually does happen across the country. But because it is so marginalized and it doesn't get out in that wide distribution, that's why it was actually for me a personal pleasure to go, oh, wait, I've got another province, or I've got another, okay. And this is what was happening kind of at that time. But it's sort of harder to try and context it into something larger of what was going on in Canadian society around legal laws. But if you look at some of the stories, I think also part of the issue that I like to raise up about this is, I think when I talk to people, it's like, oh, let's talk about queer comics. The first things people think about is like, oh, you're gonna talk about erotic comics. No, we can't, no. And all the stories, honestly, that I saw had a bit of eroticism to them, but that was not the intent of there. Yes, Class Comics is very erotic comics, but Sean Martin was not about everyone, what was going on. That's just what the community was like. Same with Leanne Francis' work and stuff like that. Yeah, you have characters checking out other characters, they may end up in a bedroom, they may not. But a lot of it was cruxed around what we need to tell our stories, because we didn't have those mentors, we didn't have that in the mainstream press. And that's why, as queer folks, we kind of looked at it and went, Okay, thanks for, that's why we still felt isolated. And technically, I still love the term in the closet because it's still used. But even from a comics point of view, we were technically still in the closet, and it was only who you knew and how you could get access to those presses.
Thanks, Brian. Anyone else like to respond to the question? Like, what role does an idea of Canada, whether that is the nation state of Canada, the territory of Canada, the histories of this space that we share, provide kind of touchstones or contours for the research that you're presenting?
I think so. I mean, you can't tell the story of the Coach House Press, which is an explicitly queer press from the moment of its foundation by Stan Bevington in the 1960s, without also telling a story about Canadian cultural policy. Because the formation, like after the Massey Commission, the formation of the Canada Council for the Arts has everything to do with long conversations between David Silcox when he's working for the government and Stan at the press about how they're going to fund all of this preposterous stuff that's being produced at the press. So it's sort of like the model that Toby Miller and George Udice talk about in their book on cultural policy, where in their formulation, like Australian cultural policy and Canadian cultural policy are very similar, because you can actually fund a kind of oppositional moment, within the framework of being a good Canadian citizen or being a good Canadian artist, as a way of maintaining a certain amount of control over it. But from very early in the Coach House history, there's Canada Council dollars going into the production of all of these wildly subversive and occasionally deeply illegal activities that are happening at the press. So there is no story about the production of that particular press without thinking about how cultural policy produces all kinds of subjects, including oppositional ones, and the works that come along with that.
Go ahead, Lorraine.
Yeah, I thought maybe I should respond and not only pass it off to a fellow panelist, but in terms of my own research, I see Canada as kind of both of two things. It's part of a material condition, right? As both Brian and Darren have spoken to, a condition of simply possibility and regulation and all of those things that are very, very important that make things happen. But at the same time, in my work, I find it also to be a pressure point and a zone of really painful contact and exclusion, very much along the lines that I explore in my presentation. And I want to refer back to a presentation from an earlier group, and that's Julie Rack's presentation on Nelvana. Hi, Julie. Because she, I think, briefly makes the point there that a kind of tradition of looking for nation and interpreting via nation has led some things to be taken up and other things to be not taken up. And she mentioned, for example, the role of appropriation in that comic. So I would say for me, it's both of those things. It's material conditions, but also pressure point and zone of contestation.
Thanks. Jamie, would you like to respond?
I would echo Lorraine's sentiment about these zones of contestation and these kind of zones of contact and exclusion. And I think what I'm trying to capture in my presentation is looking at a movement that's writing back against the dominant historical narrative and the idea of comics as a subversive medium, and kind of also contesting the idea of how we perform historiography in Canada, the idea of the archive as a source of knowledge. And I think a lot of these creators are both making use of primary source documentation, but in many ways also challenging the need for primary source documentation. So in this way, we're kind of seeing this unstable terrain being grappled upon, where does the nation dictate the terms of knowledge? So I think we're really seeing that with some creators. I know David Alexander Robertson's work is geared towards a youth audience in the works that I highlighted in my presentation, but really implicit in those comics is a critique of what is the Canadian nation state doing, and how is it functioning if it can't provide a good life for all of its citizens? It's going past that Canada washing and that whitewashing, saying, look, here's Indigenous soldier who really went to war for Canada, was very accomplished. But then it's going further from that for him and saying, and coming back, these were the laws he faced that were discriminatory. This is how the state failed him despite his service. So I think there's gradations of nuance there we hadn't seen in more propagandist works that preceded it. So I think these works are really challenging the way we perceive these conversations.
Thank you. So again, what about the kind of other side of this then, right? If we bracket the Canadianness of these works and these histories, like what are some of the other places where these texts and creators are in contact? And I'm thinking of, like, for instance, Leah Meisemer's work on what she theorizes as a correspondence zone kind of transnationally between different communities of creators, and that seems to me to maybe provide a way of thinking through some of the things that Lorraine has to say about a kind of trans-Pacific contact zone in Yahgulanaas's work, kind of transnational avant-garde movements with respect to Darren's work, the kind of North American underground press and kind of alternative press movements that seem to be kind of generative for some of the publishing venues that are important particularly in the earlier end of the history that Brian relates. Thoughts about kind of other contexts in which we can ground these texts so that they are part of a history of Canadian cartooning with those terms in the ironizing scare quotes that we need to put them in, but also deeply situated in other histories as well. Darren, go ahead.
Well, one thing that might be worth thinking about is the role of booksellers, and particular stores in all of this. In the story around The Cage, of course, there's, Charlie Huskin's This Ain't the Rosedale Library. There's Nikki Drombolis's Letters Books, Pages on Queen Street. So all of these stores, and I mean, now, of course, A.A. Bronson is running Printed Matter in New York City. So like these stores, Art Metropole in Toronto for years and years, all of these stores and the booksellers play really important roles in circulating titles. Nikki's claim that he was the first Toronto bookseller to stock Raw is really kind of interesting to me. So if we think about this in terms of regimes of circulation, beginning with booksellers might be a really interesting way to tell part of this story.
Go ahead, Lorraine.
I really like this idea of correspondence zone and its potentialities for thinking about alternate configurations. One thing that comes to mind is to think about transnational activisms, right? And I think of a work like, for example, Gord Hill's 500 Years of Resistance comic book, and the way in which it threads through long histories of Indigenous resistance in relation to South American, global movements of activism.
Brian or Jamie?
I'm also interested in the correspondence zone as a place of writing back outside of the conventions. I flagged some of John Olby's work in my original presentation as someone that's using a digital space to write back against the conventions of the education system. And in that way, I think it's a subversive to a norm, in the sense that his comics at this stage aren't likely to be included within a provincial or national curriculum. But reading his work, I can't see a good argument as to why. So I think that he's really kind of challenging the way history is taught in these spaces. And so he's periphery to this correspondence zone. He's writing to it, but it's not writing back to him at this juncture. So I think that as that conversation is progressing, it's almost a wedge trying to break space into that zone of correspondence from the outside.
So I would probably echo, I mean, yeah, the zone of correspondence definitely in North America, Canada, and mostly American publishers. I mean, I think the thing that comes up to mind was Leanne Francis mentions that she probably wouldn't have felt successful with something like publishing Lillian by Dyke if it wasn't for Alison Beschel. Like Alison was a mentor to her, and she thanks her in an interview at an actual conference in America for queer comics, where she says, yeah, I wouldn't even been able to come here and sell my product if I hadn't done that correspondence with Alison. In my own research, yeah, I mean, in my own research, I actually got to correspond a bit with Justin Hall, so who wrote No Straight Lines, because I approached him to say, well, you've done some queer comics research, you've got a book about North America. I'm looking at this from a Canadian point of view. Do you know some Canadians? And he was fascinated because he's like, I haven't actually tried to decipher the North American scene from who's Canadian, who's not. Definitely, you know, I could argue the history of, you know, as Darren said, it was like the publishing houses and the bookstores. I mean, you could talk about queer history bookstores, right? Outside of Glad Day. I mean, there are comic stores even in Winnipeg that got cracked down in the 80s and 90s because of, and it wasn't because they were just selling queer comics, but because of other comics that they were selling that the underground scene. The local police authorities or whoever in power decided, no, you know, a child has access to this. This is not right. We need to like prevent this, or you need to do like now we do with cigarettes, right? Everything is completely back there against the wall. And that kind of like, that sort of preclude access. Access to anything of queer material would always be, even queer magazines. I mean, you go to a magazine store, honestly, every story I can tell you that of people's identities with it was hide it in the, you know, the popular science, hide it in the thing. Hopefully when you're buying it, they're not going to ask you what, you know, oh, you must be queer because clearly you have this magazine about men, women, and all this, which was always interesting. And the underground scene obviously it was kind of like, it's like the garage sale. Who do you know? You publish so many. It's like this, and the zine scene is rich for queer history that I didn't even get the chance to explore because there's small publishing things where it is. Having a zine fest in Toronto really helps out. For me, I think more that correspondence has happened more since the 2000s. It really started happening more in North America and the California, the West Coast scene, simply because there were comic book conferences going on in San Diego that had queer panels. Andy Mangalis had a whole article in comic scene magazines talking about the history of queer comics, of just superheroes and what was going on in DC at the time. And Justin Hall is now in that group. There's a group now called Prism that actually does awards for queer publications. They don't care if you're Canadian or American, it's North American. And they're part of this queer conference that called FlameCon, which happens on a regular basis as well. So, I mean, and that's where they had to build that network, whether you were American or Canadian, because they found themselves being like, who else is doing this? And I should also just give a shout out to TCAF, because TCAF has held some queer venues at their events that have really helped out to get North American and Canadian queer comic creators and stuff like that, at least access to each other to have those discussions. And I guess finally, of course, you know, the one I always hate to talk about, you could always do, you know, queer comics on the history of censorship and any comic and out there and stuff like that to talk about what was going on with the Little Sisters versus the Border Services. But like I said before, the raids on comic book stores because of material being handled that was deemed obscene.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Before moving on to my next question, I just want to, would anyone like to circle back around to something one of your co-presenters said? Just want to make sure this isn't just a like say your piece and move on, one and done kind of situation. Okay, well then the next question I'll ask. I was thinking a lot about the way that Jamie's presentation evokes and echoes some of these very long-standing critiques of state multiculturalism in Canada as a technique of population management that preserves rather than disrupts the status quo while kind of like wrapping it in a PR-friendly package, right? Like the idea of the colorful tiles of our multicultural mosaic distracting from like the white grout that fixes them in place. And I think this should prompt some caution as we attempt to draw attention to comics and cartoonists who have been heretofore neglected by comic scholars, in the sense that, you know, pointing to people who have been overlooked or texts that have been overlooked is only the beginning. And the question is, how do we tell that history going forward, and how do we tell it in relation to other histories that have been dominant before now? So how, in your view, how do we bring the works and artists that you're talking about into dialogue with existing conceptions of Canadian comics history without like containing them or tokenizing them or gentrifying them? Conversely, or putting it another way, how could we use these histories that you're telling us to fundamentally change the way we talk about the history of comics in Canada more broadly, which I think is hopefully the goal that we ultimately want to get towards. Any thoughts from any of you? I mean, I think this touches on some of the questions of value that come up very centrally in Darren's presentation, although as well, obviously, as echoing Jamie's discussion of multiculturalism. Go ahead, Lorraine.
I really enjoyed Darren's question from his presentation. What gets lost when we keep concepts of masterpiece and genius, et cetera? And it seems to me that interacts really, really interestingly with Canada's comment in the chat about, are there ways of being more attentive to, I'm reading her here, spaces, places, times, communities in which these works are created and circulate?
Can I just interrupt the panel here and just say something? What made me think of that is one of our keynotes tomorrow, Cole Paul's, his second book is Pizza Punks, and it's about punks eating pizza. And, his first book was Dakukata Warriors, and it's been embraced as an Indigenous language revival comic. But he has said in many times that Gord Hill is one of his sort of mentors and idols because they share skater culture. And so thinking about correspondences and affiliations, I'm just wondering how we as scholars can be really attentive to the less visible spaces and places that comics are coming from. And I'm thinking about Brian's talk and the way that what we call queer comics is really many different kinds of queer comics. And how do we as scholars parse that? And I think we have to be really careful. And everyone on the panel is being very careful, and I so appreciate that. But just thinking about all the things we don't know, and the great comment that Matthew Murray said that some people from marginalized communities don't even want other people outside those communities to read their zines, and may certainly not want them in Library and Archives Canada. So these panels are this panel is speaking to the earlier panels in really productive ways, I think. But sorry to interrupt. I'll go back to turning off. I'll mute myself.
I mean, I think maybe something that adds into this kind of the question that's been on the table in terms of like, okay, well, now how do we kind of rearrange or reorient this historiography is the question of like, are all of these histories ours to tell too, which I think speaks to Matthew's comment, right? That these artifacts are for particular audiences, they're for particular discursive communities. They may not be for posterity in the way that we might imagine from up in the ivory tower here.
So I'll jump in. The reason honestly, one of my reasons for doing my research was actually the Queer Archives had a book out called Out North, which talked about activism and stuff like that. But what I found interesting, and because I know friends of mine who'd worked at the Queer Archives, is there's nothing about comics, like nothing. There's buttons, there's activism, stuff like that. And when I was doing my research, I reached out to the archives to find out, what did they have in their collection already? And telling them about what I was doing in my research. And what I did was I donated the articles I did for Sequential to the archives, because that at least would be a starting point for people to have a look at. And the archives isn't necessarily, and I think it's the term archives, or the core archives, now they call themselves, is people think archives are this white institutional thing of boring librarians and stuff like that. And please believe me, librarians are not boring. I've got too many good librarian friends that I could always do drinks with. But it's not. It's actually there for the queer community space, so that there is some place that queer people can go for their research needs, or to get to them, to identify pieces of that history work that they are doing, so we can have that voice out there. And so for me, starting to do some of this work, and I shouldn't say it's just, it's not just the queer archives. Western University has an archive, which is actually is their graphic novel section. I'm going blank. Saskatchewan, BC, has archives of this material. I guess maybe for me, one of the ways would be great, and I only say this, and this is my clause on all this, is that my research is really a drop in the bucket. Honestly, I'm basically a white cisgendered gay male. I don't know what was going on really in the lesbian scene. I have no idea what's going on in the bisexual scene. Right now, transgender scene is great. Gender pronouns, wonderful. But I'm also aging myself to go, this is new stuff for me too, and I'm navigating it in terms of a space. But I would, a starting point for me, I think for any researchers and stuff like that, and maybe that's the elephant in the room that I always tell people, is like, I would love and encourage anyone who is a trans person to do some to start looking around. Same with any women out there that are lesbian or bisexual, please, because I'm looking at this from I've found little negative, interesting stuff, but I inherently have a lens that looks at things like, oh, is this a superhero? Is it not a superhero? Oh, hey, what's the story? What was going on at that time? Honestly, it would be wonderful, just as a starting point, if either the archives or somebody got out there and said, just like Justin Hall did, publish a quick book with the permissions of all the people out there to say, here's a brief history, but it's not all of it out there. And it's a starting point for the conversation.
Okay. Maybe then the next question I'll ask is, I was reflecting on your presentations this week as I was preparing my notes, and I found myself continually returning to an essay by Sarah Ahmed, where she describes the world that we inhabit as an inheritance from the past, and that's a particular kind of language that is stuck with me for a long time, and in that essay she's thinking about some problematic inheritances from the past, but every history passes something forward to the present. And so I'd love to hear each of you on the panel reflect on what you think artists and readers today can learn from returning to the histories of queer, avant-garde, Indigenous, and community-engaged cartooning that you've outlined in your presentations. Jamie, maybe would you like to respond to that as a practitioner as well?
Sure. So I think I'll speak to that from the lens of a comics maker, in that one of my motivations when I was working on the Christie Pitts graphic novel was a real sense of anger in not seeing Jewish history as I knew Jewish history represented. And, when my father came to Canada, he came to a Canada where, Jews were still barred from private members clubs, living in certain areas of the city. He came from, the preceding generation, being the none is too many generation, being refused immigration to Canada based on the fact that they were Jews. And this seemed a known history in the Jewish community, but a history that didn't exist outside of it. I remember going to a baseball game when I was younger with my high school, and the crowd just screaming at us that we were dirty Jews, and there being fistfights in the stands. And, this is Winnipeg in a not too distant past here. And I felt that those experiences that I was having, that my father had, that, other people in this community had, were kind of being brushed to the side of what was the mainstream conversation in academia, and the statistics were there, but people didn't believe the statistics, and the anecdotes were common. People didn't believe the anecdotes. And my peers read graphic novels. So I came not really as an academic or a researcher first, but as someone that was young and that was angry and wanted to share a story that I knew was true, to paint a picture of this history at the time. So I think that self-representational graphic novel is entering the conversation without permission. It's entering the conversation without asking first. And we're putting these things out there as best we can in the same mentality as early zine makers, where, you're printing 1,000 copies and shipping them out of the trunk of your car and you're hoping for the best. And I think that that angry maker culture still has a lot to offer the Canadian scene.
Thank you. Other thoughts on what what we can take from the histories that you have outlined for us? What lessons to draw? Lorraine, go ahead.
Just quickly, I guess the first thing I thought it was a really interesting question. You know what, as we think so much about disrupting and moving and doing otherwise, right? Important to think about what you also carry with you. I would say importance of alternate allegiances and especially friendship as a kind of energizing force. That's something we could take with us.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, Barbidi, if I can, Barbidi actually wrote an interesting article about that, about the friendship between the trio. I mean, Brown and Matt and things like that. So that would be a parting point, for example.
Darren or Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I always keep coming back to cultural policy as a productive force, you know, because I think Canada is small enough in a lot of ways that it's hard to draw clear lines between inside and outside, and you know what's funded and what's not, what's subversive and what's not in what category, because you know it's historically specific, but it changes over time. But I think many of these relationships are much more complicated than you know, common sense would have it.
Yeah, I was going to echo some, I mean, I'm just going to pick up, I agree with what Jamie was talking about on a lot of stuff, because that's where I was finding with some of the comics that I was looking at was, unless you actually look at the broader history of what was going on with queer history in Canada, that's where I started feeling that, yeah, I'm getting angry too, and realizing that a lot of the stuff that I feel privileged now having, and I'm going to say the word privilege, was because there were people going to the streets and fighting for this thing. Fighting for equal rights, fighting for inclusion into things, civil marriage. And you look at the history and it's interesting just from a broad viewpoint of like which province was doing what at the time. And then you should try and context that with the who was present in that province doing something. I mean, the stories are there. You just need to, you know, get into it a bit more to go, yeah, there's always the broad character stories you have, but there are nuances in that were going on. I mean, again, Sean Martin's work with Doc and Raider, he was told by fans when things got a little rough, you know, he started talking about AIDS, he started talking about domestic violence in relationships and stuff like that. His fans were kind of like, oh, no, we want them to be happy people. And Sean Martin was like, I don't want them to be happy people. They grow up in real time. They address the real issues that are happening in our community. And it may not be happening. You want that perfect, idealized, this is a wonderful relationship piece, and it's not. I mean, relationships within the characters themselves were dynamic at times, and I think that reflected some things in the queer history that we see in Canada. For me, I think one of the things to bring forward is we have definitely had this explosion again, and I say in like more 2014, 2016 on the whole diversity that we have in our community. And honestly, we're still pushing the envelopes within our own communities, and I think those voices need to be looked at, you know, just on the, here's some historical things we know, but you guys probably know a bit more than I do on some of these thought streams about trans right, about indigiqueer and two-spirited and stuff like that. And I just recently got back from Nelson, that's just an hour away from here, for the Kootenays Queer History Display, and they brought in Indigenous perspectives and trans perspectives into a history timeline, and it was wonderful to see. Because we're starting to see ourselves as a community. It's like we can't isolate ourselves as being just homosexual, just lesbian, just bisexual. I mean, friends of mine are now into polyamorous relationships, and I'm like, wonderful. I'm glad you love everybody, because that's really in the end goal, I think, what everyone needs to understand. But for people coming out, I guess my viewpoint is the history is rich. There's still probably things need to be to find. These voices were out there. We need to recognize that they were not out in the mainstream, and we need to bring them out to recognize that these voices are creating a history in Canadian comics and queer comics. And then I would say moving forward, we also have to recognize that we have some great voices out there, and they're adding to that dialogue. And I have no idea what the future is going to be. I mean, the future might be we're going to have polyamorous comic books about relationships, and I'm like, all for it. Whatever, the more the merrier.
Okay, so in just a minute, we're going to turn things over to the audience for some questions for our presenters. So if you've got something that's been percolating, you can start furiously typing it into the chat box. And this is a warning for a heads up for Zach, who's going to be doing some filtering. You can also, again, raise your virtual hand under the reactions button. But while people are doing that furious typing, while Zach is collating his pages of notes from this active chat box, maybe I'll just quickly ask if any of the presenters have questions that they would like to ask one another. Okay, well, then I'll ask Zach to give us our Letterman style top 10 countdown of questions that have been collated from the chat. Zach, do you have a question to start us off?
There is a question from Anna. Anna, would you like to ask your question out loud, or would you like me to read it for you?
I can ask it if you want. I mean, someone pointed out that there was a presentation earlier on it, which I couldn't make it to the earlier part of this, so I apologize if this is repetitive for anybody. But I was just wondering, for Brian, but also anybody who would like to ask it, if you were interested in expanding on some of the specific differences between sort of the censorship context in Canada versus the US. I mean, I primarily study US comics, so despite being Canadian, I'm not familiar with a lot of this history and like sort of the legal aspects of it, though I do know from some of my research on sexuality and stuff that certain texts have been banned in Canada that haven't been banned in the States and vice versa. So if you were interested in expanding on that at all, I'd love to hear it.
Well, Anna, I'm going to tell you, you probably have you probably more into censorship than I I would be. I mean, for me, I can only think of like in the research I was looking at, really, it's kind of just touch points around censorship. I mean, definitely the Little Sisters case really was very interesting because what the Little Sisters case dealt with was Little Sisters is one of our first gay bookstores in Vancouver, outside of Glad Day in Toronto. The Little Sisters was always targeted, honestly, by customs and the government just on the material that they were, because it was considered obscene or not appropriate for minors. They had inventory constantly stopped at the border, or just disappearing, or obviously, you know, border checking and seeing what's in there, putting black marker across certain things so they could only sell certain stuff. I think also had to do the distribution market. So the reason Little Sisters went in 2000 finally to the courts and said, you know what, we're argue about what is meant by obscene and censorship under Canadian law, for the Canadian Border Services to say, why are you confiscating these materials? And it actually was around 4 books. 2 of them were the Meat Man anthology, which is, you know, notorious for being, you know, quite explicit in sometimes, and it was a European North American artist at the time. And it did kind of get into the point where, unfortunately, yeah, the Border Services won in terms of what they could deem as being obscene, but they were told that they still have to distribute some of the material that Little Sisters was waiting for. Little Sisters waited a year and so for that to happen, and Border Services was still confiscating material. So they went back to the courts to say, well, if we're going to have to keep going to the court system, we'd like the federal government to pay for this cost for us to go into the courts. And that's actually what happened in about 2007. Unfortunately, Little Sisters lost the case, but it definitely got some interesting discussions, even from artists out there in the queer scene about, and the non-queer scene in Canada. There was 2 anthologies from Arsenal Press, What's Right, What's Wrong, which actually started asking that question about why is art considered censored? And why are we censoring this sort of stuff? So unfortunately, yeah, it still continues to this day that certain materials will still get confiscated across the border. And that's also why sometimes when you're ordering something on Amazon or eBay or Etsy, sometimes for American distribution or European, you're kind of like, oh, if it goes through customs, am I going to get a letter? Is customs going to call me up and say, oh, why did you get this? But yeah, I mean, honestly, for me, censorship has always been one of those, it's more the arts and stuff like that. And yeah, I don't actually have a legal background. I talked to a couple of my friends who are queer lawyers about that case, and all they ever could tell me was like, oh yeah, I remember that case, but it was just kind of like case law. They didn't know enough of the history to comment on the censorship part of it. But definitely, I mean, that would be an interesting viewpoint to say, you know, is there slight differences between, you know, what was in that border of like what Canada determines as obscene versus America obscene. And is that why we feel that we have actually more of an, for me, I find there's more American publications out there than Canadian specific publications. Is that because it's very hard for us to get it back up here or not? And are we creating more of a local scene now because of independent publishers in Canada that can say, I don't care if you're a queer artist and stuff like that, this is a great story, we can publish it here in Canada. And maybe it's at places like Amazon or something that's have got over that censorship order to say, yeah, it's basically it's global distribution now.
Would anyone else like to comment on this question before we move on?
I just want to say that in the chat, there's a really good discussion about the differences, some of the legal differences, and about problems around transporting comics material. So for anybody who's not looking at the chat, I really think it's useful.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, if I do, there's a discussion around the US Canada comics distributor Diamond Comics. It's true. So Matthew Murray mentioned something about this. The issue with Go-Go Boy was exactly that. So Go-Go Boy was one of Canada's first queer superheroes. Sorry, North Star. That was published here in Canada, out in Vancouver. Only three issues and an ash can. Good luck finding it. And they basically said they tried to push through, like some distributors have tried to do Diamond Comics, and Diamond Comics basically looked at it and went, again, I love this term, we're not ready. This will be causing. But I think also part of the problem with Diamond Comics, honestly, too, was distributors want a large volume and they want it at certain times. And it's very hard for small independent people to produce those large volumes to get distributed out there at a time as well. And also from what I gather, because I haven't actually seen the issues, I've heard comments, and I always love these comments from people, that the issues weren't really well drawn and the stories were kind of bland. And I look at that going, I don't care how badly drawn a story is or how bland you think the story is, it's all art to me. And I think it's worthy of having a story out there. And if it's something significant, like, yeah, it was Canada's first gay superhero by Canadians, great. I'd like to read it. I don't care if the art is like on toilet paper.
Other questions from the audience?
I actually have a question, if I can try and formulate it. But there were two comments from your discussions that really struck me here. And first, it's this idea that Jamie shared regarding the way that works about or by historically marginalized individuals are finding their way to readers today without asking permission, which I thought was so brilliantly said. And then second, these questions surrounding who should or can tell certain stories. And I'm wondering if, and this is for everybody, if maybe you could speak a little bit about your thoughts regarding the importance for creating a space today in today's Canadian comics market for new voices, or not new voices, but voices that have been traditionally underrepresented, and what impact that increased visibility might have on our commitments to look backwards into the history to challenge those dominant narratives.
Thanks, Zach. Anyone like to start us off in response to that question?
Zach, would you be able to reframe that question for me one more time?
Yeah, it may not have been worded very well. I guess what I'm thinking about is specifically about if you can talk about the importance of creating spaces, allowing, I don't want to use these types of words, but finding ways for voices of individuals who have historically not been represented in Canadian comics. If you can talk about the way that our increased visibility of those works today and the space that they are finding now in this Canadian market, if that has an impact on what we're doing today, for instance, thinking about this idea of rewriting and going backwards and challenging, what has been for a very long time considered the dominant narrative. I guess framed really, really simply, it's just does the increase of visibility in these works do anything to make us want to challenge, or are these challenges from outside of the work? Are they influenced by culture and society more than they're influenced by the visibility of these works that we're seeing today?
Okay, Zach. Well, so when your last point, I would say yes. I think it is the challenges of what society wanted to, what was willing to accept at the time, especially around queer comics versus what we're willing to see now. I mean, simply answering to that, it's like, are there spaces that could be created? I see spaces that are being created now. Some of them are just, they're small independent run things, right? Like, I know the Canada Comics Open Library was having queer artists in residence, queer comic creator in residence, and having them doing talks and promoting those types of works. I know zine publishers that have, you know, work with people and young and youth to be like, hey, let's just do a small on the street zine creation and press. I mean, you could have, I mean, TCAF has attempted some of those stuff to even have just panel discussions around stuff, but a lot of times with TCAF, I know it is more of the newer stuff that's coming out, and I know there have been issues and controversies with TCAF for the last couple of years, and I know nothing enough about that to comment. I just found that having some of those spaces and permitting those types of marginalized artists and works out there to say, you know, and maybe it is, and maybe, you know, some comic conventions hate me when I say this, but offering, you know, giving them a table for a lower discounted price or something like that, because you have that space, not only offers it for people to be exposed to that cultural, that understanding, and to have those discussions, because let's be quite honest, you got people that go to conferences that just want to buy whatever they want, right? And I found that I go to conferences because I find something interesting and new, and I want to talk to the artist. I want to find out a bit more about their story, because to me, I value the story behind the publication more than, okay, this was a great publication, I really wanted to get that, but I wanted to hear about some of the struggles. For me, I think it's just, I mean, I think it is happening. I can't think of other, I mean, I'm drawing a blank on how you can promote more. Maybe it is, you know, I think it is that we have, for the queer culture community, so that we still push ourselves in our own spaces to try and have these kind of things. For me, it's more the recognition that there are queer Canadian comics out there that are, you know, we can branch them in the broader, and it's fine. It's a safe space to branch them in the North American side of stuff. I'm just interested on the Canadian side of comics and comic making and the queer communities out there, because for me, and I think Andrew Wheeler said this best in his anthology, it's like finding any representation for an LGBTQ plus person out there in a graphic novel or book form that says, hey, guess what? We're out there too. Here's a voice. You have a voice that you can actually like somewhat relate to. And I think this is why it's getting crazy with like Marvel and DC coming out with more and more, you know, bisexual superheroes. Yeah. But it's like, for me, I think if you're engaging with those communities, maybe it is engage with some of those communities that ask that question, but don't expect a response right away. Maybe it is something that they prefer as a queer community, that we have our own space, that we have those forums. Glad Day now as a coffee shop can have an event as well that could be zine or comic making. I mean, that's all options that are on the table for this.
Okay. Brian, there's a very quick question for you, a factual question from Dominic. Do you know if the Rand Holmes retrospective book reprinted all the Harold Head stuff?
That I don't know. I think most of it was just some of it. And it really there is an interesting discussion around the Harold Head homosexual angle on that one. That is an interesting discussion amongst friends who knew Rand Holmes at the time, and where his headspace might have been about that. But definitely that came about because he was ticked off completely, and rightfully so, about the book Everything You Wanted to Know Sex But Was Afraid to Ask, which was a controversial book in '69 that came out that was very homophobic. And Rand Holmes was basically his Harold Head piece was basically against that. And that's why I look at it as that is the first piece that a lot of the queer community dovetails into what was going on in the 70s, to say, especially if the body politic picked it up and Rand was working with them to say, hey, here's something that we know is going to help push the margins out there as to what's acceptable to push against homophobia.
Thank you. There's a question from Irene about intersectionality in comics. Irene, would you like to pose that question to the panel, or shall I read it? Okay, so I will go ahead and ask, has there been, or perhaps how could we build some spaces in which we can focus more more assertively on intersectionality in comics, rather than kind of, dividing up comics production by identity categories? Irene says, I think this would be a really fruitful area of research and conversation, how all those levels of identities interact and move within the social and publication spheres. So thoughts on how we kind of start connecting some of these conversations and histories so that they're not taking place in separate tracks, in separate little sidebars on corners of the pages in our Canadian comics history textbook that apparently isn't. Maybe that's another thing we'll write coming out of this conference. Canada put it on the list. How do we start connecting these different histories together? Lorraine, sorry, you were pushed into the next bar of thing for me. I didn't see your hand there.
No worries. Well, a very kind of maybe simple-minded response is to say simply follow the comics producers, because they're already doing it, right? So I think of, just to pull an example out of my head, a creator whose work I like very much, Kat Verhoeven. I mean, looking at their work, sexuality, gender, embodiment, eating disorders, class, race, it's really all there. So I think just being attentive and following where the comics creators are already, I think, way ahead of us.
Other responses?
I would echo those sentiments, and maybe from a comics maker's perspective, say that historically, if we go back to these points of origins as we represent our own communities, if we're missing these intersectional angles, I think perhaps we've missed elements of history that are worth bringing to the forefront. When I was originally working on Christie Pitts, that was a critique I had early in the manuscripting process, saying what other newcomer groups are being left out of this conversation. And I think there's always work to be done, and it's an imperfect process. But if it's overt that it's not existing within the work, that's often a creative failure to not understand the historical context.
Any other comments on this in response to this question? Okay, I believe we have a question from Canada.
Yes, thanks. And I'm just so inspired by this conversation, and also what's happening in the chat. And don't worry, we're catching all the links, so we will get them out. But if you just hold up a book, I might not get that. So put the link in the chat. Looking at you, Julie. So my question, it kind of gets to the heart of what this symposium is about, but really my question is whether each of the panelists thinks there is value in even maintaining the idea of Canadian comics as a rubric, or whether we as a discipline are just falling into the already well-worn road of Canadian literature and Canadian history using national paradigms. And I know certainly Jamie and Lorraine, in your presentations, I think you're really strongly arguing for decolonizing Canadian comic studies based on the works you've looked at specifically by Indigenous artists. But I'm really torn, because on the one hand, my big research project is on refugee comics, and I hate borders, and I hate organizing principles around the state, and I hate passports and everything else. And on the other hand, how else can we organize the work being produced within this nation state? Because as Darren points out, so much of it is dependent on cultural policy and arm's length funding agencies. So I know it's a big kind of existential crisis moment for us as a field, but do we want to keep organizing around the idea of the nation state? Or how can we come together as scholars, all looking at different traditions and artists happening on this territory without always reinscribing the colonial framework?
That's a fantastic question. I mean, I think what we risk is dehistoricizing questions around the field if we ignore those kinds of issues around nation. Like one of the first, when I was teaching Scott Pilgrim, one of the first questions that I asked my undergrad class was, how Canadian is Scott Pilgrim? And like Scott Pilgrim and Hope Larson's work has everything to do with cultural policy. So the Schuster Awards, our National Comics Award, which are of course named around a Canadian who co-created the most famous American superhero. There was a moment when they were trying to decide whether O'Malley and Larson were eligible for the Schuster Award, depending on where they were living. So and this is all on their blog, like you can go and look it up. But when they were living in the States, they said, okay, O'Malley was born in London, Ontario, so he's always a Canadian. So it doesn't matter if he's living in the United States, we will count his work as Canadian for the purposes of our awards. But because Larson, even when they were living in Canada, was a landed immigrant, she was never eligible for a Schuster. So Canadianness is a function of cultural policy. Moving back and forth across those borders creates questions and problems for anybody who puts themselves in the position of adjudicating Canadianness around national production. So we can't ignore it, right? And on top of that, my point about the Coach House is that we live in a country where the avant-garde and oppositional authors are regularly subvented by taxpayer money. So we actually pay for the critique of our own culture through taxpayer dollars. So like so Canadianness is literally created by those bodies that are authorized by government agencies to give money to presses, to give money to authors in the interest of the public good. So like we can have aspirations about what we might like to be. We can hope for a decolonized future, but we can't not pay attention to the way that cultural policy creates a sense of nation and a sense of border in things that are published in this country.
I might follow that just with a comment that those realities can also be challenged. We're running Dirty Water Comics deliberately at this point without federal or provincial granting. And we're running it to have the opportunity to bring the voices to the forefront that might not be brought by those bodies. So I think that you're absolutely right that we have to acknowledge the realities in which cultural production takes place. But that doesn't mean we can't challenge them.
I mean, all I would say in response to that is, okay, but that also requires a relationship to cultural policy. Like refusing to take the money is having a relationship to government funding. And in a sense, like it puts everything in the hand of the market. So there's a different set of questions that emerge as a result of that. But it doesn't obviate the problem of having to think about the way that government funded bodies have produced a national literature since at least the Massey Commission.
I'm not disagreeing with that at all. And I'm just trying to make the side point to your main argument that there are other back channels, and that although addressing that conversation is essential, we don't have to let it be the only exclusionary force.
Julie?
Thanks, Benjamin. I think that there's also an ethical discussion to be had about what do you do when you foreground the nation as an organizing principle. And that really speaks to what Lorraine was talking about, because it is a colonizing and an act of violence, right? It does exist that way, symbolically and materially. So, I mean, part of the work that I have done and Lorraine has done has been in CanLit. So I first of all wish to register my relief that I am not having this discussion in that venue. Yeah, and that's because so many people's livelihoods have depended on continuing the conversation in what are painful and damaging ways. So I agree with Darren, you can't get away from Canada as a thing. Like you can't. It has all sorts of power, symbolic, actual, whatever. It structures our identities in ways that some of us don't want, but it doesn't have to be the only organizing principle. It can be the location where something occurs. It can be the discourse that flows through and around us that we sometimes say no to and sometimes say yes to, and sometimes we don't know what's happening with it. It can be part of international flows of information. So I am also a member of the 2S GLBTQ everything else community. And as a member of that community, that is not just a Canadian situation and never will be, right? So for me, and also I think that considerations around language that we heard earlier today have to be part of that. But to me, it's nationalism I don't want. And so when we're in a discussion around what does it mean to study comics in Canada? What are comics? What are they? And what is it here? I think that's what you do. I think you decenter the nation as the only category or the first category, just like you do when you think about history. Do you really mean that you're looking for the origins? Because if there's one thing people who study comics are good at, it's critiquing a single origin story, because you know, which superhero do you know besides Superman who's problematic, has an origin story that's just one story? I give you the Submariner. So to me, I think that we need to think a little bit about being aware of what those things are, but I agree with Darren that we can't just say they're not there. And that's true of any kind of attempt to think the nation. It's just going to remain a problem. And I think that's productive. Thanks for letting me weigh in.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, what I'm kind of hearing from this conversation, right, is the need to continue to tell a story that in which the nation state is an actor on the stage that we're accounting for, but is maybe not the hero of the story anymore. We're running past time by a couple minutes. Candida, do you have a really quick summative comment?
Yeah, just coming back to Darren and Jamie, I really hope everyone watches Vianne's pre-recorded presentation, partly because it's really irreverent and funky, but also she really has no relationship that I can see to the nation state or even the province of Quebec. And it's all about self-publishing and the respectability of that in the Montreal scene. So I also just want to put a plug, and it's something I borrow from the writer Dion Brand, that maybe artists are located in cities or they're cosmopolitan more than being members of a nation. But I really want people to watch Vianne's video because I think this conversation can continue in really interesting ways in that panel tomorrow. And thank you so much for your thoughtful responses.
Okay, well, I will echo that thanks to our 4 panelists, to all of you who spent your afternoon or whatever time it is in the time zone in which you are currently located with us, thinking about how we can tell the story of Canadian comics differently than we have in the past. So we've got a short break now, and then we're returning with the GLAM roundtable at 4 o'clock. So thank you all, and take care until then. Bye-bye.